4 minutes. 6 pulls of a trigger. A 16-year-old walks into his brother's kitchen, borrows the house key, unlocks a gun safe, loads a weapon, and in a matter of seconds ends 3 lives, a young mother and her 2 small children. His victims had trusted him. They had opened their home to him. On October 3, 2025, Judge John Kissinger Jr. looked at that same teenager, now 19, and said quietly, "This is a narrow path." Then came the sentence, 60 years to life in prison. The boy was Eric Sweeney, and the victims were his sister-in-law Kayla Sweeney, age 25, and her sons Eli, 4, and Owen, 3. On the morning of August 3, 2022, Londonderry police received a 911 call reporting gunshots at the Sweeney home on West Road. When officers arrived, they found a scene that would haunt the community for years. Kayla and the children were dead, and Eric, the quiet teenager everyone thought they knew, had fled on foot. He was caught shortly after, walking alone along a dirt path, hands covered in gun residue, saying little except that he had made a mistake. In court, the details were painstakingly reconstructed. How Eric had entered the home that morning, how he retrieved the gun, and how a moment of rage or confusion, no one can say exactly which, spiraled into irreversible violence. The prosecution called it a calculated act. The defense described it as a tragic break in a deeply troubled mind. But everyone agreed on one thing. The damage was beyond repair. What led to this moment? What cracked in that home? And how did a case that began with calls for vengeance evolve into one focused on mental health, trauma, and the meaning of rehabilitation? This is the story of Eric Sweeney, victim, perpetrator, and everything in between. To understand what happened inside the Sweeney home, you have to start with the family itself, a close-knit, ordinary New England family trying to hold itself together after years of quiet strain. Eric Sweeney was the youngest of 3 brothers. He lived part-time with his parents in Londonderry, but often spent weekends at his oldest brother Michael's house, where Michael lived with his wife Kayla and their 2 boys, Eli and Owen. Kayla, by every account, was kind and patient, a stay-at-home mother who treated Eric like her own son. She'd help him with schoolwork, made sure he ate well, and encouraged him to talk when he seemed withdrawn. But beneath that surface, cracks had already started to form. Eric struggled in school, not academically, but socially. Teachers described him as distant, sometimes disconnected, prone to zoning out during class. He wasn't violent, but he had difficulty processing frustration and anger. His parents had been worried about his growing isolation during the pandemic. The shift to online learning had left him even more withdrawn. According to court documents and psychiatric evaluations presented later, Eric had shown early signs of depression and emotional instability that went largely untreated. At home, tensions simmered quietly. Eric's relationship with his brother Michael, the father of the victims, was complicated. Michael had taken on a parental role at times, which Eric reportedly resented. Family friends said he often felt overshadowed by his older brothers, who were already working and living independently. Kayla tried to bridge that gap, inviting Eric over for dinners and including him in family outings. But as prosecutors later argued, something inside Eric began to shift, a growing resentment that mixed with confusion, loneliness, and a desire for control he didn't understand. By mid-2022, small arguments had become more frequent. Neighbors recalled hearing shouting on a few occasions, though nothing that suggested real danger. But inside Eric's mind, things were unraveling. He started keeping to himself, stopped hanging out with classmates, and began spending long hours alone, both at home and at Michael's house. Investigators would later find notebooks filled with fragmented thoughts, anger, guilt, and a recurring line, "I just want it to stop." It was this quiet deterioration, unnoticed, unaddressed, and untreated, that set the stage for what would happen next. It was a Wednesday, August 3, 2022, a typical New England summer morning. The sun had just climbed over the trees lining West Road, the air still cool before the day's heat. Inside the Sweeney home, Kayla was getting her boys ready for breakfast. 4-year-old Eli wanted his cereal in the blue bowl, while 3-year-old Owen had already run off with a toy truck. Nothing about that morning felt unusual. Not to the neighbors, not to Kayla, and certainly not to the 2 little boys laughing in the living room. A few miles away, Eric Sweeney left his parents' home earlier than usual. He told them he was going to help his brother with something around the house, a routine visit he'd made many times before. In his pocket was the spare key to his brother's home, and in his backpack, according to police reports, was a small notebook. He didn't text anyone, didn't call, and didn't post a thing online that morning. At around 9:30 a.m., a neighbor saw him walking up the Sweeney's driveway. He used the key to enter through the back door, as he often did. Investigators later pieced together the sequence of events from surveillance footage, 911 logs, and ballistic evidence. Eric went straight to the den, where a locked gun safe was kept, and retrieved a 9mm handgun registered to his brother. It was the same firearm his brother used for home protection, stored legally and out of reach of the children. Minutes later, the first gunshot rang out, then another and another, 6 shots in total, all fired within the span of 4 minutes. Kayla was struck multiple times in the kitchen. The boys, who had been in the living room, were found close together. The medical examiner later testified that the entire event lasted less than 5 minutes from the first shot to silence. At 9:38 a.m., a neighbor called 911 after hearing what she thought were popping sounds. By the time officers arrived, the front door was slightly ajar, and Eric was gone. Police swept through the home and quickly realized what had happened. The responding officer's report described the scene as beyond comprehension. Eric was found less than 2 hours later walking along a wooded trail less than half a mile away. He didn't resist arrest. When officers approached, he raised his hands and said, "It's over." He was 16. When officers took Eric Sweeney into custody, the initial reaction wasn't anger, it was disbelief. The boy they were handcuffing didn't look like a killer. He was quiet, thin, pale, and visibly shaking. According to the police report, Eric kept glancing down at his hands as if still trying to process what he had done. His clothes were stained, his shoes muddy from the woods, but there was no struggle, no resistance. One of the officers who arrested him later said he looked lost, like he didn't know if this was real. At the Londonderry Police Department, investigators began what would become one of the most scrutinized juvenile interrogations in the state's history. The questioning was recorded, later played in court, and lasted just under 2 hours. Sitting in a gray interview room, Eric barely lifted his head. Detectives started gently, asking if he knew why he was there. After several minutes of silence, Eric spoke softly, "Because I hurt them." Over the next hour, he gave a fragmented account, not an organized confession, but broken pieces of memory. He said he'd gone to the house to get something from the safe, though he never explained what triggered him to use the gun. When asked why he fired, he paused for a long time and said only, "It happened fast. They were yelling." Police later confirmed that there had been no signs of a struggle inside the house, no forced entry, no defensive wounds suggesting a fight. That led prosecutors to believe the attack was sudden and unprovoked. Investigators also noted that Eric appeared detached during questioning, showing little emotion except confusion when told the 2 children had died. His only response was, "Both of them?" After being formally charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, Eric was transferred to a juvenile detention facility in Manchester. The state later petitioned to try him as an adult, a move supported by prosecutors given the nature of the crime. His defense team, however, immediately began building a case around mental health, citing his young age and reports of long-term emotional instability. News of the arrest spread fast. The town of Londonderry, a place of just over 25,000 people, struggled to process the idea that a boy they'd seen at school games and local shops was now accused of murdering his family. For weeks, neighbors left flowers and stuffed toys outside the Sweeney home, a silent tribute to Kayla, Eli, and Owen. Meanwhile, inside the juvenile detention center, Eric's world had shrunk to a concrete room, a steel bed, and the long, uncertain wait for trial. The investigation into the Sweeney murders became one of the most exhaustive in New Hampshire's recent history. From the moment police entered the home, every detail, every blood spatter, every fingerprint, every footprint was catalogued. The crime scene itself told a chillingly methodical story. Kayla Sweeney, 29, was found in the kitchen near the back door, a single gunshot wound to the chest. Her sons, Eli, age 4, and Owen, age 2, were discovered in the living room, each shot once while playing with toys. None of them had defensive injuries. The lack of struggle suggested that Kayla likely recognized Eric and never saw the danger coming. A half-eaten sandwich sat on the counter. A baby monitor blinked quietly in the background when officers arrived. The .22 caliber handgun used in the shooting was recovered in the backyard, dropped near a flower bed. Ballistics confirmed it was registered to Eric's brother, Kayla's husband, and had been stored in a locked safe inside the master bedroom. There were no signs of forced entry on the safe, meaning Eric knew the code. Investigators pieced together a rough timeline. Around 3:45 p.m., Eric was seen by a neighbor entering the home. By 4:02 p.m., a nearby doorbell camera captured him leaving hurriedly, his hoodie pulled tight over his head. Less than 10 minutes later, Kayla's sister called 911 after receiving a missed FaceTime call from one of the kids and hearing strange background noises. When police arrived, the house was silent. Detectives also examined Eric's phone and found several disturbing notes saved in the days before the murders. One simply read, "I don't feel real anymore." Another said, "She never listens, he never listens." While there were no direct threats, the writings painted a picture of growing alienation and anger toward his family, feelings his defense would later describe as untreated adolescent rage mixed with emotional isolation. The forensic psychologist assigned to the case later testified that Eric exhibited signs consistent with major depressive disorder and dissociative episodes. But prosecutors argued that the methodical actions, retrieving the gun, loading it, walking calmly through the house, showed deliberation, not loss of control. The community's grief soon hardened into outrage. Candlelight vigils turned into tense town meetings as residents debated how something like this could happen unnoticed. How could a family trust a boy who would later take everything from them? By the time Eric's trial date was set, months later, the question was no longer whether he had done it. The evidence was overwhelming, but why? Why had a 16-year-old boy with no prior record, no history of violence, suddenly erupted into unimaginable cruelty? When Eric Sweeney's trial began in September 2024, the courtroom was packed. The prosecution laid out a clear, detailed narrative, a calculated attack by a teenager who knew his victims and had planned access to the weapon. Prosecutors emphasized that Eric had entered the home willingly, retrieved a gun from a locked safe, and carried out the murders with precision. They argued that while Eric's age might suggest immaturity, the planning and execution of the crime demonstrated an alarming level of intent. The defense, on the other hand, focused heavily on Eric's age and mental health history. They presented school records, psychiatrist evaluations, and testimony from his parents and relatives. Experts described a boy who struggled with depression, emotional detachment, and impulsive decision-making. They argued that Eric's actions, while tragic, were the result of untreated mental health issues and adolescent psychological fragility. One psychologist testified that Eric had episodes where he felt disconnected from reality, which contributed to his inability to process consequences fully. During witness testimony, neighbors and friends painted a portrait of Eric as a quiet, withdrawn teenager. Some admitted they had noticed mood swings and occasional outbursts, but had no idea he was capable of violence. Michael Sweeney, Eric's older brother and the father of the victims, spoke briefly in court, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. He expressed grief and shock, stating that no one had anticipated the magnitude of Eric's actions.
The trial also delved into the ethical dilemma of trying a minor as an adult. Prosecutors argued that the severity of the crime and the loss of innocent life warranted adult sentencing, while the defense countered that rehabilitation and psychological treatment were more appropriate. The debate sparked wider discussion in New Hampshire about juvenile justice, mental health intervention, and the limits of accountability for teenage offenders. Evidence included ballistics reports, security camera footage, and Eric's own statements during the police interrogation. Each piece reinforced the prosecution's position that the crime had been deliberate. Yet, throughout the proceedings, jurors were asked to balance this evidence with the reality that Eric was still a minor at the time of the killings, facing the psychological and emotional complexities of adolescence. After weeks of testimony, the trial moved to closing arguments. The prosecution called for the maximum sentence, emphasizing justice for Kayla, Eli, and Owen. The defense urged the court to consider Eric's age, mental health, and potential for rehabilitation, framing the case as a tragedy born from a combination of neglect, trauma, and adolescent instability. Ultimately, the trial was not just about assigning blame. It was about examining how society responds when a young person commits an act of irreversible violence, and whether the legal system can balance punishment with the possibility of redemption. The defense strategy centered almost entirely on Eric Sweeney's mental health and psychological background. Attorneys painted a portrait of a boy struggling long before the tragedy, one whose actions were influenced by emotional instability, depression, and untreated trauma. School counselors testified that Eric had been withdrawn for years, often disengaged in class and prone to sudden emotional outbursts. Teachers recalled instances where he seemed to zone out for long periods, a sign, they said, of deeper psychological issues.
Psychologists brought in during the trial highlighted patterns consistent with major depressive disorder and dissociative episodes, suggesting that Eric sometimes experienced moments where he felt disconnected from reality. These episodes, they argued, contributed to a temporary inability to fully grasp the consequences of his actions. One expert explained that adolescents' brains, particularly in areas responsible for impulse control and long-term decision-making, are still developing, making them more susceptible to extreme behavior when emotions overwhelm reason. The defense also presented family history and environmental factors. Eric's parents described a childhood filled with instability, periods of neglect, and inconsistent emotional support. His interactions with his older brother, Michael, sometimes involved tension and feelings of inadequacy. According to the defense, these underlying stressors, combined with a lack of mental health intervention, created the conditions for the eventual tragedy. During testimony, Eric himself spoke sparingly but conveyed remorse, stating that he wished he could undo what had happened. Though his words were measured, they revealed a deep sense of regret and an awareness, however belated, of the magnitude of his actions. The defense urged the court to consider this remorse, arguing that it indicated a potential for rehabilitation rather than a permanent, irredeemable criminal disposition. Throughout this part of the trial, the debate over juvenile versus adult accountability remained central. While the prosecution emphasized the premeditated nature of the crime, the defense focused on the adolescent brain, psychological vulnerability, and the potential for change. Their argument was clear. Eric Sweeney was not beyond redemption. He was a young person who made an unfathomable choice under complex psychological pressures. This framing challenged the court to consider whether justice for the victims could coexist with a recognition of Eric's developmental and mental state. And it set the stage for one of the most emotionally and legally charged sentencing decisions in the state's recent history. After weeks of testimony, deliberation, and legal argument, the moment of truth arrived. On October 3, 2025, Judge John Kissinger, Jr. entered the courtroom. Families, journalists, and townspeople waited in tense silence as the hearing began. The court reviewed the charges, 3 counts of first-degree murder, all stemming from Eric Sweeney's actions on August 3, 2022. Evidence had been overwhelming. Ballistics, surveillance footage, forensic reports, and Eric's own statements left little doubt about what occurred. When the judge spoke, his tone was measured but firm.
He acknowledged the tragedy and loss experienced by the victim's family, emphasizing that the murders were deliberate and devastating. At the same time, Judge Kissinger highlighted Eric's age at the time of the crime and the expert testimony regarding his mental health. He noted the difficult balance the court must strike between punishment and potential rehabilitation, particularly when a minor commits such an extreme act. Then came the sentence: 60 years to life in prison. The judge described it as a narrow path, recognizing both the severity of the crime and Eric's potential for future growth if properly guided. While the prosecution had sought the maximum sentence and the defense had pushed for rehabilitation, the judge's ruling represented a compromise that accounted for legal precedent, the victim's loss, and Eric's developmental stage. The courtroom remained quiet as the sentence was read. Eric, now 19, appeared calm, his expression unreadable. For the families of Kayla, Eli, and Owen, the ruling was a small measure of justice, a recognition that the young man responsible would spend decades behind bars. For the community, it was a stark reminder of how quickly trust can be shattered and how a single act by one individual can ripple across an entire town. The verdict also reignited public discussion about juvenile justice, mental health intervention, and society's responsibilities to adolescents showing signs of emotional or psychological distress. Lawyers, psychologists, and policymakers debated whether the sentence struck the right balance between accountability and compassion, reflecting the broader challenges of the American legal system in cases involving minors. The impact of the Sweeney case extended far beyond the courtroom. In Londonderry, a town that prided itself on safety and close community ties, residents struggled to reconcile the violence with the everyday normalcy of their streets. Candlelight vigils were held for Kayla, Eli, and Owen, attended by neighbors, friends, and even strangers who had followed the case through news coverage. Flowers, toys, and handwritten notes were left outside the family home, a testament to the community's grief and the innocence lost that day. Schools and local organizations began addressing the emotional toll the tragedy had on students and families. Counselors were brought in to speak with children who had known Eric at school, as well as peers who were shocked by the actions of someone so young. Social workers emphasized the importance of mental health awareness, noting that Eric's struggles had been visible but insufficiently addressed before the crime. The broader public also engaged in debates about juvenile justice. Media coverage explored questions such as, how should the law treat minors who commit adult-level crimes? What role does mental health play in accountability? Could intervention have prevented the tragedy? Policymakers and advocacy groups used the case to push for better access to mental health services in schools and communities, highlighting the warning signs that had preceded the murders. For Eric, life inside the correctional system began in earnest. While the sentence was long, his attorneys emphasized that rehabilitation programs would be available, including therapy, educational opportunities, and counseling aimed at addressing the root causes of his behavior. The court record reflected an ongoing tension. While society demanded justice for the victims, there remained a recognition that the defendant was still a young person capable of change. For the families, the aftermath was complex and ongoing. Michael Sweeney, the father of the victims and Eric's older brother, faced a mixture of grief, anger, and the complicated realities of sibling relationships strained by tragedy. Friends and extended families struggled with their own feelings, caught between mourning the loss of loved ones and confronting the reality of Eric's actions. The tragedy left a permanent imprint on Londonderry, reshaping perceptions of safety, family, and adolescent behavior. The case became a reference point for discussions about prevention, accountability, and the challenges of identifying and supporting vulnerable youth before circumstances escalate into irreversible acts of violence.